Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. And you join us for the second part of our epic conversation with Lindsay, Sharman and Laurence, Owen, the creative minds behind the Ballad of Anne and Mary, a new 5-part musical drama podcast about those famous 18th century pirates, Anne, Bonny and Mary Read. In just a minute, you'll be able to hear the second part of that conversation, where we talk about the story and the narrative of this fantastic new musical, and we dissect the opening number. So, let's hear that now, in the title song of the entire production, The Ballad of Anne and Mary.
Come, travellers and friends, gather round. A ballad have I to chill and astound, of ships run aground, of good sailors drowned at the hands of Anne and Mary. Man that is born of a woman have only the shortest of time for to be, and nowhere are folks more aware of that fate than a terrible, ravenous sea, where the waves they do tower, the winds they do blow, and krakens and monsters drag men down below. But some men are so wicked, the devil himself has cast them back up from his hell. Yes, some men and some women as well.
They say that my hair became red from the blood of the innocent sailors I've slain. They say we were crueler than Avery himself and more vicious than Blackbeard or Vane. They say it's bad luck to have women on board, and that 2 on 1 ship is a crime against God, and that crime will bring terrible luck to mankind. They say we're a plague and a curse. Yes, they say lots of things about us.
What kind of woman becomes a pirate? How did these angels come to fall? Men will be devils if they desire, but how can a woman be a pirate at all?
Flame-haired Anne, Bonny and Mary Read,
Her raven locks stiff with the brine, with breasts bursting free of their binding men's shirts,
What? No, they weren't.
and bountiful booty behind.
their tight breeches are hugging voluptuous thighs,
Stop right there!
with ruby red lips and hellfire in their eyes.
And the slip a forked tongue in your ear. Do you try to resist their unholy demands? Will you join them or die by their hands?
That's not true. Why aren't you listening to a word we're saying?
Flash the 2 beauties reveal their true form as a hydra beast vile to behold.
Stop with this nonsense.
Like a 2-headed reaper, they fight back to back, hacking bodies and harvesting souls.
You're oversimplifying.
Massacre all but who bow to their will. They feed off the lives of the sailors that they kill.
And the last thing you'll see as their cutlasses spill your insides on the bloody deck are 2 she-devils locked in the kiss.
Musical Talk. Laurence, Lindsay, fantastic again to speak to you. I really enjoyed our conversation last week where we were talking about how the Ballad of Anne and Mary, your new online podcast musical, sort of came to be in the history of, well, its sort of development through other works of yours. And so last week we were talking about the developmental things that you'd done since you'd left Edinburgh in 2019 and the things that you'd learnt from creating a previous podcast called Mockery Manor, which was fantastic, but also included music in a diegetic sense, i.e. as part of a narrative, to The Ballad of Anne and Mary, which is more of a musical. So I think in terms of time, we're spring 2020. COVID-19 has unfortunately turned up and Britain is in lockdown, which was a terrible thing, but it did give people some space to do some other things with their lives. Perhaps. Let's clutch at straws for that terrible time. Let's set the scene then. So Anna Mary's in your head. It's something you want to do. Mockery Manor is coming to its end. It's still finishing off, but you've got the ideas. How does Anna Mary come to be?
So it was a bit dependent on funding. And around August, September, we secured some decent funding from the UEA and the whole focus of that funding was actually Anne and Mary. So I put forward a budget and everything, and I bid for this particular grant, and we got it.
Can I just say, God bless them. Thank you.
Yeah, God bless them. Absolutely.
The old UEA.
Yeah. They have been really supportive, which has been great. So we started plotting from there. And I think we underestimated how much everything was going to cost and how long it would take. Well, I certainly underestimated how long it was going to take because I thought we were going to release it in October.
Yeah, I do remember quite a lot of conversations that we had where I was going, I think it might take a little bit longer than that,
I was
Lindsay.
like, Laurence, you underestimate yourself. It'll be fine.
Lindsay, can I ask, have you been involved with the Crossrail project?
Yeah, I should never get involved in those sort of
Infrastructure.
logistics.
It's very flattering, the speed and efficiency with which you think that I can make these things happen with it.
I didn't even finish writing the script till January, so I don't know what
was going on there.
Yeah, so that was really more an R&D kind of
We were
period.
R&Ding for a lot of 2020 and playing around, kind of quite luxuriously for us with this idea, because there was no, if we're working towards an Edinburgh Fringe, for instance, then there's a pretty strict deadline because it's like, well, that's the month that it happens, and so it has to be done.
Yeah, if you miss August.
Yeah, then you've had it. But with this, we were setting our own deadlines, and as much as we wanted to do it as quickly as we could, we did allow ourselves a good amount of time to sort of play around with ideas and experiment.
And it helped us realise the scope of it as well. So by about November, we were like, oh, it's going to take longer, it's going to cost more. So then we applied for an Arts Council grant, and we managed to get that as well. And so from receiving that influx, we could really go full steam ahead. So January is when it really kicked off.
Yes, so we started the process of remote recording all of our actors, and the entire thing has been remote recorded because of the time this took place, and we've never done it completely remotely recorded podcast production before. So that was a fresh challenge in itself, but also the integration of singing with spoken dialogue. I mean, that's hard anyway. You hear that clunk sometimes in films that are produced outside of COVID times that have huge budgets. You can still hear a little bit like, oh, well, that's where the on-set recording becomes the studio recording.
The sound quality is often the giveaway, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly with really old films. You listen to West Side Story or something, I love it. I mean, it's gorgeous, but the sort of slightly clunky mono recording suddenly turns into a beautiful studio, some gorgeous old microphone going into a beautiful analog desk, and it all just sounds pristine. And you go, oh, here we are. And often with those musicals, it's another singer as well.
But they should have probably done that a bit more with some of the modern recordings, like the film version of Les Miserables. They caned those actors' voices and made them sing again and again and again on set.
Yes,
they?
insisting on doing everything on set.
And that's why everyone sounds hoarse as hell.
Yeah.
Well, do you know, this is going to be, I think, a never-ending issue for musical film, funnily enough, because it's, do you bring in ghost singers, the Marnie Nixons, or do you let the actual singers sing it themselves, bearing in mind that those singers probably didn't last sing since they left acting school?
Yeah, I mean, you get wonderful actors who are doing their best, but I think there's no shame in bringing in the ghost singers if it's going to make the thing better.
Yes.
Yeah, because the difference between an actor who sings and a singer is quite a leap, I think.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And while an actor who sings is great for certain types of roles, we've come to decide, haven't we? Like the ones that can be really character, that are more about the character and the rough edges of that character than they are about the beautiful singing voice. They're great for that, but I think you get a real powerful singer in a primarily singing role, and knocks your socks off.
Yeah.
It does. I agree with you. I mean, we're on a tangent here, but when have we never not been? But is it Lee Marvin who sang "I Was Born Under a Wandering Star" in one of his cowboy films.
Yes.
And he sings it like this. You know, but it is a characterful song, and you wouldn't want that sung in that context differently.
No.
But when you're seeing the film of Les Miserables or even Mamma Mia, for goodness sake,
Yes.
then perhaps you just want a little bit more smoothness upon the ears.
Pierce Brosnan.
Funny he should come to
Yes.
mind. But I wouldn't go and see the Mamma Mia films because I was looking for authenticity in the singing actions of the actors. You know, I'm going into that film or those films for a good time, and therefore I'd like my ears to have a good time too.
Yes, true.
Yeah, because they live on the songs, don't they? They live and
They do, yes.
It's
die on
been
them.
an interesting question in casting a musical ourselves, because obviously this is the first time we have made a musical that doesn't purely feature just us. Every other time it was first of all it was just me singing, and then it was the two of us singing. And
Yeah, and I'm an actor who barely sings.
But 100% increase in your singing capabilities there.
Yeah.
Marvellous.
Yeah, it was so nice to be able to write for other people, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And when it became clear that we were able to involve some of the people that we have been able to involve in this project, the freedom that gave us to write really, to not hold back on the songwriting and write some really difficult stuff that really stretches them in a nice, fun way. Yeah, it's great.
Bringing us back to Anna Mary a little bit then, from our film tangent, but you've just mentioned freedom. You know, having the professionals who can sing gives you the freedom, therefore, to extend what it is that you're doing beyond some limits you might have set yourselves, both narratively and in terms of songwriting, because you know that the people can meet your requirements of them. And yet, at the same time, I find this interesting, but this is life mirroring art in the sense that if there's it seems to me, and you can tell me I'm wrong here, but there's a very strong golden thread in terms of a thematic thing being explored in at least the first episode of the Ballad of Anna Mary about freedom. I mean, there's the overt stuff about it starting in Newgate Prison, where our pirates are actually incarcerated. And then there's references to freedom regularly in the text. There's the sense of freedom when Mary Read is singing in her song, look at these men, they're my brothers, essentially, which she's fighting with soldiers in Europe, and she's disguised as a man. But she feels a freedom, even though she is not being who she is because she's a woman pretending to be a man. She feels a freedom in the camaraderie. And there's a sense of control in the life of Anne Bonny as well, in her early life, where she has a stepmother who doesn't like her and a weak father, and she's feisty in a tearaway. She needs freedom in an otherwise constrained world. And so she's drawn to her life in the Pirates' Republic as a form of freedom. I'm just interested in this idea of freedom of creativity for you both in the writing, and then freedom is coming through in the text. And of course, one can't forget that it's also being written in a period of lockdown, which is the greatest curtailment of freedom in the loosest sense that any British citizen has certainly had, and most people, beyond Britain as well, but certainly in a British context where we've ever had. We understand why. No one's objecting, or most people aren't objecting to that, but we understand why. But, freedom is very much in people's minds at the moment in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were you aware of that consciously? Or?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's one of the themes. Yeah, for sure. So the freedom sort of touches everything. It's even to the point where the tone is, we wanted something reasonably escapist so that we could give people a sense of freedom when they were listening to it. There's personal freedom. There's the kind of freedoms you're allowed within certain societies. So obviously the early 18th century was not a great time for most people, but also why now is often a question of why have you taken this story and why are you telling it now? And a lot of the ways that they are being constricted, or the routes they find to freedom, and yet they are met with a kind of censure because society frowns on them. That still reflects a lot of what happens nowadays as well. So yeah. Well done for spotting that. I'm very pleased when people spot the themes.
And interestingly, you've just raised something interestingly there. Why now for telling the Anne and Mary story? Now, purely, presumably by coincidence, I don't think is there a significant anniversary or looming or anything like that? I only ask because since lockdown started, one of the stories that came out was that there was a proposal in a British coastal town to erect statues to Anne Bonny and Mary Read as female pirates, which then hit the news partly because in lockdown they were looking for any news story that wasn't related to health, so it probably was promoted slightly higher than it might have done normally. But also there was a kind of sort of pushback from the residents of that area saying, well, why would we be honouring criminals? Let's not forget that in real life, Anne and Mary were probably not awfully nice people, and we'll talk about the difference between the perception of pirates, and these two pirates in particular, and the reality of the humans involved, the people that they were, because that's also a very important part of this story. But was that, when that hoved into view in the national press, did you rub your hands and go, hooray, this makes everything helpful? Or did you think, oh, that's strange, and then just carry on writing? Or did it have any effect?
Well, I think that might have been some clever marketing by another audio drama centred on Anne and Mary. And when that hoved into view, so there's one called Hellcats on Audible. And when that happens...
Sorry, can I say Audible being the company? It's not actually called Hellcats on Audible, is it?
No. Inaudible Hellcats.
So it's an Audible production called Hellcats.
And it's I think it's like 8-part drama, something like that.
Yeah, it's not a musical.
Yeah.
The story is really back to life.
Yeah. And when it hit, we were a bit like, oh God, what are the chances? You're like knee deep in writing this damn thing, and then someone else releases before you do.
It was a slightly worrying morning.
Yeah, but then we listened to a bit of it and we were like, this is a different beast to what we have. Ours is a musical for a start.
Yeah.
And that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of deliberately not listening to all of it. I mean, it sounds great, and I can't wait to listen to it when we're done, but we don't want to be sort of too influenced by it.
Yeah, we just listened to enough to go, have we hit some of the same story beats? And some of them are going to be inevitable because they're historical facts, but we've taken a lot of liberties with the Anne and Mary story as well. I've invented, for a start, they were never in Newgate. So I just wanted to check that there wasn't some mad coincidence where...
the same liberties had been taken.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and also the framing device that we have with Nathaniel Mist writing a general history of pirates. That's the kind of the entry point into their story. I just wanted to check that doesn't happen in Hellcats as well.
Yes,
and it doesn't. And God, as soon as I realised that, I relaxed.
Yes.
So people should listen to both, really, actually, but they should start with you.
Yeah. For 8 hours of drama, they must have had to invent a few things as well, because there just isn't that much on Anne and Mary.
Well, the whole point is that a lot of what we, in inverted commas, know about and Bonny and Mary Read comes from this one book, The General History of the Pirates, which is actually pretty vague on the details of a lot of things in itself. And we don't even know when Anne Bonny died, what happened to her after a certain point. There's a lot of mystery, so it does leave it open to a lot of fun interpretation.
She could still be alive.
She could still be alive. I heard she
She's
runs a gas station now somewhere.
Yeah, she sells other people's videos she's a pirate.
Yeah.
She sells pirated videos.
But did you think for any of and it's interesting that it might have been a slightly concocted furore, but did you find any of the story that related to it? People saying, why are we honouring these criminals? That was the story that the press latched onto, it seemed to me. Did you have any sense of that when you were writing this? Now, I think I know the answer to this because I've listened to the first episode of The Ballad of Anne and Mary, which is called Take the Steel. And I think you've done something very clever that allows you to very clearly say that we're moving beyond the popular image of just, when people talk about pirates, there aren't actually many stereotypes that we don't latch onto. They're either highwaymen of the sea and they're rotters, or they're sort of comedy pirates. I'm thinking Asterix here. But, there aren't... and Long John Silver, of course. But actually, in popular culture, they have been really reduced from being the individuals that they were into a set of stereotypes and attributes. And your story, of course, takes that as a first step and then actually shows there's some real people underneath. But sorry, I'm talking ahead of myself. Back to the idea. Were you concerned in any way that people would say, why on earth are you even bothering with these two people?
No, it was actually serendipity, because I had already decided that one of the themes of the story was going to be who's telling these stories, how far away from reality are they, the sort of influence of gossip and salaciousness and prurience and everything. And so actually the fact that people respond in exactly the same way to the pirates, the idea of glorifying pirates as the characters do was just like, brilliant. I predicted this.
Yeah.
Because A General History of Pirates actually started the mythology of pirates as we know it. Treasure Island was influenced massively by A General History of Pirates, which came out in about 1722, I think.
The fact is that people are now behaving in exactly the same way as they did 300 years ago.
The front page of A General History of Pirates, it lists the pirates that are within the book. And as the headliners, the names are bigger than any of the other pirates. It says Bonny and Mary Read. So their names were used to sell the book. Now, but the interesting thing is they don't even get their own chapter. They're within the chapter Captain Jack Rackham, who was their captain. Their bits are just within that chapter. And the bit on Anne Bonny mainly centres on her mum stealing a spoon. There's this huge, long, totally pointless, as far as I can tell, story about how she was accused of stealing a spoon and then it was found under her mattress and then actually it turns out she probably didn't steal the spoon. It's like, where's the stuff on Anne Bonny? This is ridiculous. So that got me thinking, how interesting. If their names have been used to sell this, then probably everyone was like, oh, those dirty slags on board the Revenge. Oh, female pirates, women pirates and everything. And I thought, well, it's not that different to how we demonise women in the press nowadays. Yeah.
Today,
and,
absolutely.
Yeah, and the
terrible.
fact that we can take someone who, I mean, you look at Meghan Markle, who's done nothing wrong at all, and the kind of vitriol that is directed against her for imagined etiquette slights, I guess. She's gone against some kind of unwritten rule. I was like, well, let's look at Anne and Mary through that lens, that the stories that have been told about them probably some distance from the reality. And what would the reality have actually been given their circumstances? What kind of people would they have likely have been shaped by their upbringing, and how what kind of personality actually becomes a pirate? You know, that's a hell of a thing to do. It's to reject society in that way is quite something. So
it is.
They're great characters, and actually Mary Read's history before she becomes a pirate could be a drama serial in itself. It's so incredible. But there wasn't enough space for me to really explore that. But I do touch on it, but not as much as really in a way I would have liked to.
I mean, I'm glad you said all that, to be honest, because frankly, at the end of the day, the idea that there are certain people who are untouchable in history is nonsense. And yes, as long as it's recognised that people who are probably not angels are not dressed up as angels, and that's of both gender, that's absolutely... you can do anything you like with a character from history. I can't imagine that many of the kings that Shakespeare wrote about were precisely as characterised. Let's put it that way. So.
Well, exactly, and it's absurd. It's absurd to think that just because people were operating outside of the law, then that the way that they actually behaved was necessarily any worse than what the government was doing and what human life was reduced to in so many cases.
I mean, to take the kind of risks to become a pirate, you've got to have decided those risks are worth it, and you've got to have decided that you are willing to put your life on the line in order to pursue this kind of lifestyle. I mean, you have. And we make this point in one of the episodes. There's no point in having a straight-up villain or a straight-up hero, unless you're talking about someone like Henry Avery, who sounds like an absolute psychopath. So some pirates, there's no point digging for their humanity, I don't think. But I think for others, you can paint a more complex picture. They're not full-on hero, they're not full-on villain. And that's just so much more interesting, I think, than the alternative.
It's humanity over stereotype, isn't it? Or attribution as well of character. And I think your opening song in that first episode is a very, very clever way and reveals very quickly the stance you're going to take. So if you don't mind me briefly talking about that, I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but I think it would be silly not to talk about that opening song, which is essentially the Ballad of Anne and Mary. Are you happy with me talking about that?
Of course, yeah. That's literally what it's called. You might be interested to know that it's called The Ballad of Anne and Mary Part 1.
Ah, lure me in, why not? And the conceit is, somebody, in this case it's Bess, the balladeer, essentially, is in the streets of early 18th century London, I assume, or it's near Newgate, so it has to be,
Yes.
singing the latest sheet music song, the Ballad of Anna Mary. And of course it's the kind of thing that exactly would have happened at the time. They were a big new sensation in their day, not just for being pirates, but as you've said, for being female pirates. You know, that allows popular thought to pile on a whole bunch of other stereotypes and misogyny and claims and goodness knows what. But, you know, they stop being human at that point immediately and start becoming these sort of caricatures. Yeah. And this ballad being sung to the populace really sort of plays it up. But then you hear, as it purports to tell the tale of Anne and Mary, we hear the characters of Anna Mary and the actors who are playing them later on singing the roles of Anna Mary, saying, they say we do this, and then, you know, it's a list of all the terrible things they've done, and then this list of terrible things gets worse and worse and worse. And so instead of they are being characters in the song, you start hearing them making asides in the song about, hang on a minute, this is nonsense, or hang on a minute, that's just a step too far, or you're really misrepresenting us here. So funnily enough, the characters who start out as being represented within this ballad then step out of the ballad as the ballad sort of continues apace without them, as though the fire is burning in relation to their reputations much faster and with more oxygen than can be controlled, and it's gone well beyond where they are. So suddenly what that does, it takes them out of the world of stereotype and puts them into the world of humanity. And humanity, let us not forget, is full of bad as well as good. So when I talk about humanity, I'm not talking about the noble instincts of humanity. I'm talking about they are just part of the spectrum of life and had their individual characteristics. But they were people. They were people first and they were people last. And the song pulls them out of cultural representation, and then the story takes off from there, as we then go and a journalist, Nathaniel Mist, goes to visit them in Newgate to try and get their story for the book about pirates. I think that is a beautiful beginning. And I really like the mechanisms. I know it's a clumsy word for what you've done with it, or the deftness, perhaps is a better way of putting it, in that first song. Because it is, as a listener, I didn't know what to expect. I wondered if I was going to get, anything from Long John Silver to Captain Pugwash. I didn't know it was going to be serious or comic or what. I didn't know anything about it in that sense. It took me immediately into the situation. These are real people.
Yes, exactly. That's what we were aiming for.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's great to hear.
Thank you for explaining that so eloquently.
I don't think we could have.
No, I definitely don't.
Although
think
possibly
we
lengthily. Sorry.
No, that's exactly what we were aiming for. We wanted to put that at the forefront right at the beginning, so that people knew what to expect, or rather, you kind of manage people's expectations from the very first second.
Yes.
Kind of go. You introduce a theme, and you kind of ask the audience to look for certain things. I think so. Asking them to look for the humanity in Anne and Mary was really important from the very beginning.
And it's the only way of giving the story longevity, actually, in a way, because if they did turn out to be yar, ha, 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 all the way through, that's lovely for one episode, possibly even for two, but I think by episode 5 I might have
we deliberately instructed all of our actors, okay, no one is allowed to do a Bristolian accent at any point in this entire
Although
thing.
one of our actors did push back and go, oh, go on. One's
He
not
insisted, so we drastically reduced his lines as a result.
Well, some of these actors don't know their R's from their elbows.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we were trying to avoid as many pirate stereotypes as we could.
Although we did put Barbara, the dread pirate Barbara,
yes.
in Newgate.
Yes.
Now, who would be playing her, Lindsay?
I don't know. Absolutely, a stellar.
There's a few roles that you were born to play, and I think she's one of them.
Yeah, deranged hag is my
forte.
Bracket, yeah.
Yes. Well, can I say before that then, if we're playing Spot the Lindsay, because I think that's a lovely little sort of meta game that we can play in this occasionally, is in that ballad scene where we hear the crowd, the street crowd. Let us not forget that the 18th century was much more rumbustious than society allows us to be now. People were a lot more coarse. I'm not making judgments. It's just, by comparison, that seems to be how people were. There's a lovely crowd scene. They're outside Newgate, which of course is famous for its public hanging. There's actually a question about whether or not Anna Mary should and will hang. And one lovely voice pipes up and says, "Oh, I love a good hanging." And I thought to myself, I detect the voice of Lindsay Sharman.
Yeah,
That's me.
There she is.
There was me.
Yeah.
Yes, and I method acted that. I do love a good hanging.
We decided
washing is impeccably dry, as a result.
We decided quite early on in our casting process that we should be the ones to play all of the bit parts, and that we should allocate the main roles to other actors who could sink their teeth into main roles, if that makes sense.
But also, in a very practical sense, when we fill out a scene, it's a lot easier for us to do. We can just hop on the microphone. Like, if a scene is sounding a bit thin, we just hop on the microphone to provide a few extra voices.
Yeah, various
And
passers-by and hags.
Yeah, and we can do that with a nice controlled environment, and, you know, we don't have to pay anyone because we're doing it, so we're very cheap. So for practical reasons, it just made sense.
Yeah.
Actually.
But it builds the sense of a place, because actually, you know, it did sound like I was in a crowd. It worked very effectively, and if 40% of the crowd were the two of you several times over, that's perfectly reasonable. You know, it's not about the crowd. It's flavour and atmosphere and sense of place, isn't it? Which is so important, particularly at the beginning of a piece like this. Let's talk a little bit more about that ballad then. I mean, there are several things. It's sort of it's as I say, it's already clever narratively, because it draws the audience into the direction of flow of the narrative. But of course, it's also a kind of, because it's an early 18th century ballad, it has to sort of match at least some of our understandings, or at least perceptions, of what those ballads were like. So it's kind of folky, and we were talking last week, I think, Laurence, that you've been interested in folk recently and all its variants, because it's one small word to represent one enormous sector of historic music, which is still alive today. I mean, you know, the script comes to you and it says, let's put the ballad in first. What did you think? How do you approach a 21st century take on an 18th century folk song telling a story that's important to the narrative, as well as also doing all those mechanistic elements that I was talking about earlier?
It was quite a long write, that one. And in fact, there was a song that I wrote, or I kind of outlined a complete other version of that, which we rejected just because it wasn't quite hitting the mark.
Oh, right. How interesting.
Yeah, so there is a completely different song called What Kind of Devil that will not ever see the light of day.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah. Well, that was sort of take one.
Or you could use it in your Edinburgh comedy show in a couple of years' time, Anne versus Mary.
Anne versus Mary. Oh, my God. Right, okay, we're doing that. Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and it is, again, it's like, from a musical point of view, there are sort of two questions running simultaneously here. Firstly, what would one of those 18th century ballads actually have sounded like? And secondly, what do we feel an 18th century ballad would have felt like to experience? And so I wanted to be quite clear from the beginning that I didn't want to just purely use the sounds musically and sort of lyrically how they would literally have been. We wanted to make something that gave the sort of impression of how it would feel. And so we're not worrying about having anachronistic instruments or anachronistic phrases and sayings, even to some extent. It just has to feel representative of what the moment would have felt like to the people in that town square.
But although we could have made it entirely diegetic, so happening in the street, we didn't want that either. We wanted it to start in a kind of exciting liminal space where you could hear the waves.
Yeah.
That felt a bit more mystic. It felt more like mythology, actually. And then we wanted to draw it into the street. And ground it in all these pretty awful people saying things like, "Oh, I love a good hanging," and not caring a jot about the humanity of Anne and Mary. So so the opening number is supposed to be as epic as possible, really. And we couldn't have done that with an actual ballad singer stood in the street with a broken old violin or something.
Yeah, it wouldn't have had the sort of hefty impact, because we needed to kind of make people realise that it's a full-scale musical, and we wanted to give them the feeling of either being in a cinema or in a big theatre, and feeling a kind of the impact of a big song at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, we were thinking quite visually when we were coming up with this, weren't we? We were thinking of Bess in a kind of blue light in the middle of the stage as it starts, ripples of water on the walls and everything, and then it opening up gradually, and so the chorus of horrible gossips.
Yeah.
sort of coming into the scene and it getting bigger and bigger and then it turning into a street scene. We really did think in visual terms for that one.
I find that absolutely fascinating, the idea that actually you visualise the staging first and then let the song sort of grow out of that to a degree.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that you're quite right what you said about it starting with the sound of water. I listened to the episode. The very first thing you hear is what I took to be the sea. And you're right. We then go into what I thought of was sort of incidental music, but was actually the introduction to the song. And we shift to outside Newgate, essentially, in this crowd. But you're right, because there's a river, but there's no sea in London. And Newgate isn't on the river particularly. So it's... I hadn't spotted the transition, and it certainly didn't jar, so I hope that's a positive thing. It seems to me that actually you managed that sort of... you needed water in it because it's a pirate story, for goodness sake. And the one thing I do know about pirates is they're very rarely landlocked. But you got that sea, and then immediately into the melee of a street scene, which you would have thought would be sort of almost counterintuitively the reverse direction you would go for a pirate story. So actually, that transition works in a lovely way.
We wanted Anne and Mary in the first song as well, and there's no way if they were stuck in prison at the time, we needed to bring them in a way, and there was no way we could do that in a diegetic sense. So to have their voices, to establish the theme of them saying it wasn't like that, we're not that bad. You're simplifying things, as they push against what Best the Ballad Singer is saying. We couldn't have had that in a diegetic scene, so we had to create this sort of liminal space. Yeah.
There's a couple of things I do just want to pick up, just almost throwaways. I do like the fact that there's what I'm going to call cod folk, and I hope I'm not in any way insulting you there, Laurence, when I say that, but, there's a lot of the wind do blow, that extra do for, to make it fit and things like that.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I like that because, it sets it up. In my head, that says, 18th century ballad. That's the way people sang in those days. I'm not sure it isn't, but that's what I feel and think. So I think you're right to tap into that.
I think cod everything is a very important way of writing these sorts of things. Like, I love when I get to do cod classical, cod Mozart and so on.
It's a way of communicating to the audience, though, isn't it? Like you say, you know where you are. We weren't going to write it in actual 18th century language.
No.
And I did look up loads of 18th century street cant, and I have sprinkled it throughout the script, but I had to start paring it away at one point because it was just too much, and you couldn't necessarily understand what was going on.
What was there was a scene where someone's saying, I'm looking for
looking for someone.
I'm looking for someone. He's what does he look like? Oh well, he's
turnip pated. I can't remember.
There was just like a huge long string of that's him, and then she'd go, big rakish scar, and then it was just like a whole load of, I can't remember any
street cant that
you'd clearly just found.
Yeah, you can't even understand what within the context of the sentence what it meant. So I had to strip it out in the end. But instead of that, you use words that communicate that to a modern audience without actually using those words.
I think that's quite interesting, and funnily enough, it ties in with the show that was in Edinburgh also in 2019, I think, called Wit and Mirth, which was a gentleman who was singing songs from an 18th century songbook.
Right.
And I interviewed him, and I remember him saying to me that he would actually only been able to pick out a handful of songs that he thought that could work in a modern context, because whilst they were all in an English that we understood, it wasn't... 18th century English is very close to 21st century English, but and the idiom of music was much more understandable than, say, even 100 years before, where Tudor music sounds totally different to late 17th and early 18th century music. I was struck by the fact that the songs he sang were quite coarse, by the way, so it's probably the closest I've got to hearing genuine 18th century songs to compare for your ballad, but I can see the family connection, if it makes any sense.
Yeah, there's so many different words for rude bits in 18th century street cant.
It's like however many words for snow in certain languages.
Yeah. Although you can see the sort of English obsession with arses and boobs.
Yeah, it's bums and farts, and it's really puerile.
Lots of farting and lots of... so many words for scrotum as well.
Yeah.
It's Carry On Queen Anne.
It really is. It's very much Carry On Queen Anne.
Yeah, and we had to make sure that we didn't go too far into that territory as well.
Yeah.
Not least because there's a name problem, because Mary and Anne are also the names of the queens of the period, aren't they?
They are, of course.
Everyone was called Mary and Anne.
Yeah, Anne's mother is called Mary, which is confusing.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Just just to finish on that song, then I know we spent a lot of time on it, but it's such an important starting song, and there's been so much thought that you've both put into it because it had to do so much. But actually, it's if you like the worst of the song also, and I don't mean in the sense of I'm judging the song. I'm talking about that the human responses that it creates. As I say, Anne and Mary, who are alive in this song and speaking in their own voice, then have to sort of step aside as their crimes, in speech marks, are piled upon them. And it is misogyny. They are the sort of the devil's mistress. And it builds up. And towards the end of the song, isn't it? It's they did this and they did this and they did this. Even more outrageous thing. And they were the devil's mistress. And then finally, the very worst thing of all, and you can just hear the period, is that they kissed each other. The sense that lesbianism is worse than being the devil's mistress.
Yeah. There it is.
And you can absolutely buy that as a sense of what the public thought at the time, and some people still would. But it's actually the misogyny of society piling on even more poison and insult onto these two as being female pirates, which is somehow much more, speech marks, unnatural than being a male pirate, even though pirates were vilified by nice society or even common society.
Yeah.
The fact that they were even worse pirates than pirates is and it's purely because of their gender, and it's just terrible. So I like the fact that the song gets carried away in its it gets the public who are singing it and joining in get carried away, but it also once again contextualizes the story in the period that we're hearing, whilst at the same time also allows us some parallels, unfortunately, with now. And that gets picked up also in the narrative. Later on when Nathaniel Mist is actually talking to Anne when she's in her jail cell, he's writing this book about piracy, and you've already said that in real terms there isn't actually that much about Anne and Mary in, even though they are, if you like, the star players in terms of books. And he's quite honest about this. I quite like the fact that you fed that into the story. He wants a little bit of titillation, essentially, the spice, as he calls it, in order to sell the book, because, having these two female famous pirates is going to be what draws people in, when in fact actually what they're going to get is hundreds of pages about various other pirates of the period, and just a little bit about them. And there's even the business about, we want to have a wood engraving of your sort of topless, bare-breasted fighting, Amazonian style, which is the famous picture handed down, of course.
It's so bizarre.
Of course, is what comes up. And the idea, it is almost like the idea of Amazons, isn't it, from Greeks and Romans, that the fact that they always insert with warrior women this idea that they've got their boobs out. it's so
bizarre and impractical.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but it does appear to me to be getting in the way of what you're trying to do.
I mean, it would be so impractical, and you can bet, and it's just. It always comes down to that as well. It always comes down to, when women are vilified, it always comes down to sexuality.
Oh, yes.
And so it's definitely an interesting area to explore. But the 18th century, early 18th century, was kind of interesting with queerness in general, because there was quite a lot of cross-dressing going on. And so women as men and men as women. There was a famous brothel owner who was either a transvestite or a trans person.
Is this Mother Clapp, by any chance?
It might be. I can't
and her Molly House.
Yeah. And there was a sort of acceptance, but at the same time, not. As almost as there is today, you're always going to, I think, have the people who are horrified and at the perversion and all that sort of thing. So that's something I wanted to explore.
Well, indeed, there's even a phrase, isn't there, when Bess, the balladeer, is trying to sell her copies of Anne and Mary and doing a roaring trade in it with these, the street people. I think it may even be Nathaniel who says that it's wonderfully perverse. You use the word perverse. It's there in the text. I like that. But it's delivered in a way that says, actually, but I'm secretly very excited by it. So.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, he knows.
It's have your cake and eat it, isn't it?
Yeah,
Sorry.
He knows that in order to sell the books, you need to titillate good Christians. You need to shock and scandalise them, because they'll hate read it. They'll buy it so they can be absolutely appalled by it and denounce it in every possible way.
Or as it's known, the tabloid press today.
Yes, exactly. In the opening scene, Laurence plays an horrible old man who goes, what does he say?
So he says, disgusting. How much? It's his one line.
Yeah.
Tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it?
Well, we recorded it one way and then recorded it a different way. This is really granular, but the first way we recorded it, we had him go, disgusting. how much? Sort of
Like
surreptitious.
he's
Oh, right,
ashamed.
yes, yes.
Like
And
he's
then we're
ashamed.
like, no, actually, he should be completely oblivious of the fact of his own hypocrisy. He should just be shelling out for it and buying
Yeah.
it and reading it, and at the same time completely convinced of his own moral superiority.
Totally. Bloody perverts.
Yeah,
I'll
so-
take two.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So doing it with exactly the same tone instead of this, dirty surreptitiousness, I think,
No
is-
questioning at all.
Yeah, it shows the absolute hypocrisy of most of, the pearl clutchers that exist.
Then after the song, we move on to a brief bit of exposition, which is where Nathaniel Mist, our journalist, and who's going to be a central character, and certainly is in episode 1 at least, meets up with Captain Barnett, who was instrumental in capturing Anne and Mary. And that actually is a very gentle, informative scene. It's so very easy to do info dump badly. Actually, I really like that scene because it sets several hairs running, including just a little throwaway mention of treasure, which, I mean, I don't know because I've not heard beyond episode 1, but I'll be stunned if it didn't come up again.
You might.
And then
Yeah. Total red herring. It's never mentioned again.
And then, fun enough, we address the issue about, I think Captain Barnett actually says the focus of the story of the history of pirates should be on the hero and not on the villains, which actually that's where we reflected that story that was in the press recently about the proposed statues of Anne and Mary. There's beautiful little bits and pieces, and the tone I love as well. There's a great deal of craft and deftness in both the songwriting and the script. And your working together here is seamless and brilliant and clever and layered. And I like the fact, and this was just on one listening, so when I go back to listen to it again, I'm sure there's going to be other bits and pieces, but just on this one listen, I like the tone, which is that actually it's serious. This is about real people. It's about some of the less pleasant aspects of life, even in polite society, all the way down to what might be called coarse society or criminal society, of course, with pirates. And yet, because it's one of your shows, it isn't po-faced. It isn't humourless. It doesn't make that mistake of thinking we can make something serious by taking away the humour. So there's lots of lovely humorous moments. I can't get enough of the I love a good hanging woman. She obviously deserves a spin-off. We've mentioned her 3 times already. But there's a lovely moment in the next scene, funnily enough, when Nathaniel finally gets an audience with Anne Bonny in the jail cell in Newgate prison, where he brings out his latest invention, which is a portable writing desk. I'm not going to tell you what the payoff is and the punchline, but it's just beautiful. It's a lovely little deft joke, and it's just enough of a moment for you to smile at the piece. There's a lot of smiling as I listen through this, and when I didn't expect there to be, because once I got the tone of it, I mean, I knew there was going to be light moments in it, but I knew that its principal point is telling the story of the humanity of the people in this story, for better or for worse.
Humanity is absurd, though, isn't it? I always think that ignoring the ludicrousness of people and their choices is a mistake that I think.
Yeah, well,
some
it's just
dramas
totally
make.
unrealistic, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, and of course ignoring the fact that people have senses of humour, as in the characters themselves. Some of them would have had a sense of humour.
Yeah.
Ignoring that is also very strange, I think. Always making stories about people who have no sense of humour is odd to me.
And yet, that is so often how. I mean, actually, even in mainstream popular culture, I mean, whilst there's often doses of humour in Hollywood films, there's quite often not. Certainly action films take themselves terribly seriously, and the only humour allowed is when, the hero, normally American, sort of turns around at the end of slaughtering everybody he doesn't like and makes a wry one-line comment to the camera. I suppose James Bond falls into that category too, although I think Bond has got a bit more
definitely.
humour, although not always. Give me Roger any day, to be honest.
At least you knew with Roger that
Yeah.
everything was ridiculous. Didn't you?
Well, with Roger, you got more. I mean, that's the best thing about it. So.
I think the main difference between the Marvel films and the DC films is that the DC films seem to be incredibly just it's so punishingly dark.
Yes.
And it's really, really grim. Everything's depressing. And then the Marvel films manage to deal with some really heavy stuff, but they do it with a lightness of touch.
Yeah.
And they never shy away from putting stupid gags
Well,
in.
I think they're acknowledging that people are going to these films for adventure and fun and escapism.
Fun,
and,
yes.
and it's absurd to ignore humour if you're looking for that kind of thing.
So, by the way, I would say if you're asking me about Batman, I'm afraid I only watch Adam West, so I do know what you're talking about, which may be pushing it even further away from
The
seriousness.
most gritty of all the
Yeah,
Batmen.
yeah.
Well, he was wearing clothes you might actually buy rather than have I mean, I don't know where all the other later film Batmans get their accoutrements from, but they're not off the shelf. Let's put it that way.
No. Moulded nipples.
Tell me, Lindsay, is that important to you?
I think that was in the George Clooney Batman. Everyone was going, "Why has the Batsuit got such prominent nipples?"
Yeah, it's a bit weird.
Well, so you can hang things from them. I mean,
Yeah.
You never know if you'll have have to hang your mask up. Yes. So, but the scene with the jailer, if you like, and then into the prison cell with Anne Bonny is full of humour, but it's delightful humour. It's gentle humour. There's some fabulous jokes, which I'm not going to ruin here. People should listen to. But there's one about moving a prisoner to the East Block, which made me roar with laughter. I thought that was fantastic. But also, at the same time, there's some lovely dexterous writing in terms of character. So, for example, as Nathaniel Mist is talking to Anne Bonny, who's in a different prison cell to her friend Mary Read, Mist refers to Mary by her first name, to Anne. And Anne is obviously touched by remembering Mary, but calls her Read. And what you get immediately there is the relationship.
Oh, interesting.
And I thought that simple 2 sentences really set up how, for me at least, I thought, all right, I completely now know how Anne sees Mary, and indeed how Nathaniel sees Mary.
Well, you might be surprised there. There is great significance in her calling her Read, but I think that it's slightly more layered, and the subsequent episodes will hopefully reveal.
I don't think we should say any more than
that.
No, please don't. But I do. But well, in which case I'm going to pat myself on the back for having spotted it. But I thought that was very nicely done. If that's a signifier of things to come as the story progresses, that was a very good, nicely dropped in. It's there if you want it, and if you don't know, it won't ruin it if you don't if you don't see it, because it will be explained. But that was fantastic. And those are the scenes I thought that really started to humanise Anne. And you also don't fall into the trap of making her lovely. She's not misrepresented. She is actually a bit of a horrible woman, if I may be so bold. She's not. Let's put it this way: she's not someone I would wish to dine with. But that's important. That she is who she is, and who she is not someone who is actually very nice, and she is on the fringes of society, and she has got a fierce personality.
I mean, she'd have to be fierce, wouldn't she? I wouldn't necessarily say she's not nice. I would say that she's been stuck in Newgate in a very vulnerable position, and so
of course
is kind of at the mercy of anyone who the turnkey decides to let in. And so that influences how she treats people.
You're quite right. Actually, Stephen Sondheim teaches us in Into the Woods that nice is different to good. So you're quite right. And we are seeing her at a very particular point. And so thank you for correcting me. I think you're absolutely right to have done so. But you're right. Nice is, in fact, actually a feeble word and shouldn't be used in this circumstance anyway. What she is she is protective in an assertive way in this, because she's quite hard. But you're right. You can already see there is a sense of affection, at least for Mary, and there may be others in her story, not least her, for what we see of him, her husband, John, later on. As always, complex characters, and one word will not do to describe them. But I would still say that she's not someone I would. From my introduction to her, she's not someone who is going at the top of my Christmas card list.
Oh yeah, well, I didn't want to do that thing that that Hollywood suggests. There's a chap who wrote a book called Save the Cat, and it's about making your protagonist likable. So you get them to save the cat early on in the script, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to. I feel it's a bit easy.
Yeah.
And it's not. So if you show their positive qualities right at the top, amongst their negative qualities, I feel like you've not got as much to explore and to uncover. And there's always, I feel like, a sense of discovery with a character that you originally don't have slightly dubious feelings about. And then you explore why you might have had those dubious feelings about them, why they're exhibiting the behaviour they do. So, yeah, I never want the protagonists to be immediately like extremely charismatic and just, you're on their side immediately.
I also like what you've done structurally with the piece, because actually there's negotiation of sorts between Nathaniel and Anne. She is very good at finding leverage, and she uses it. And actually, it's about communication with Mary. But what you've done through that is you've managed to make the story epistolic. It's you've actually set up the reason why it's a 5-part podcast, because actually it's it's clarified that the story is going to be told over a number of sittings. And through that storytelling, and even what we get in episode 1 alone, the layers are starting, we start off very briefly at least with Anne as a baby.
Yeah.
And then the things move on from there. But, you see some of her formative bits and pieces quite quickly. And actually, the Anne there is different from the Anne we're seeing in the prison cell. Or not different, but you can see she's at a much earlier stage of her development. I like the fact that over the next few episodes, through the narrative of telling her story for the journalist, we're actually going to flash back and forth. And I'm sure there's more to it than this, but it's the peeling of the layers, isn't it?
And the flashbacks are where the music comes in as well. So there's diegetic music in the 1720 London scenes, but the songs come in the flashbacks because we wanted there to be. Because you know how in musicals everyone bursting into song can occasionally be a bit weird and unnatural.
I may be immune to that sense, but I know what you mean.
But when it's a story about storytelling, so when the fact that Anne is telling a story, she's delving into memory. Memory is not necessarily reliable,
of course,
and it has a dreamlike quality. So, it makes sense to have the music, that have the songs within the flashbacks.
And any songs that we hear in the present day London, in inverted commas, so the 1720 London, the Nathaniel's London, is music that's being played by a street performer, and that's it. And that's other than that, it's just the cold, hard light of reality, with no singing and no fantasy. But when a story is being told, it can go off in any directions. And the songs that we, the listener, are hearing are kind of the songs that Nathaniel is imagining as the stories are told to him.
So it's stories filtered through other people's stories. And so then it brings in the idea of this, there's a lack of reliability to stories that get told and retold and retold and retold. And then we end up with this unreal perspective of these real people.
It's a malleable truth, isn't it? Yes.
Absolutely.
I have been entranced by episode 1, and I've already said several times that I'm really very now keen to hear episodes 4 to 5. But how can particularly people hear about Mockery Manor, which we discussed last week, and the fabulous The Ballad of Anne and Mary?
Well, you can go to www.longcatmedia.com, which will tell you everything you'd want to know about both of those projects. But you can also find Mockery Manor, the full series, and The Ballad of Anne and Mary, episode 1, soon to be episode 2, which is coming out weekly throughout May. You can find them wherever you would get podcasts. So that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, basically wherever you would go to download podcasts, you can find it.
But there's links on the website as well.
There are, yes.
So you can, just for ease of access, go to the website and click on it. And there you
go. Musical talk. And there you have it, part 2 of that wonderful conversation with Lindsay Sharman and Laurence Owen, as we discussed their fantastic 5-part musical podcast, The Ballad of Anne and Mary. Now, parts 1 and 2 have already been released at the time that this episode is broadcast, with 3 more to come over the course of May 2021. So do go along and see if you can find it. I can guarantee you'll have a fantastic time. It's a great drama and it's a great musical. The songs and the narrative work really well together, and I hope that hearing the actual opening number, The Ballad of Anne and Mary Part 1 in brackets, has whetted your appetite to hear more of it. It certainly has for me. And you can join me again next week when I conclude that fantastic conversation with Lindsay and Laurence, when we talk more about the score of that wonderful podcast. Remember, to find out more about The Ballad of Anne and Mary, or Mockery Manor, or indeed any of the other productions that Laurence and Lindsay are behind, go along to their website, longcatmedia.com. And not only that, next week we'll be playing an entirely different song from the score of this fantastic podcast. And I think next week is my favourite. So be sure to turn up again for that. But if you are planning to turn up, it suggests that you need first to have left. And so let me put that part of the mechanics into operation. Let's all bring this episode to an end, I think mutually. I'll stop talking in just a minute and you can turn it off and go on with the rest of your life, at least for a week. And therefore, I think we have a rendezvous for 7 days' time. That sounds like a plan. Let's put it into operation. And I'm going to do that by ending this episode with the magic word. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2021, except for the song where the copyright remains with Laurence and Lindsay. And my thanks go to them both for allowing me to play their fantastic song in this episode. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. 3, 2, 1, go.
So that was a bit better. I think we've got slightly better.
Slightly is the word, I think. And so we were talking about how you'd had the idea and been developing it from... Oh, gosh, I've lost all my ability to speak. Isn't that
Sorry,
terrible?
I shouldn't have said it.
I don't think that's your fault. I think that's entirely mine.